Walter Jackson froze as the four-star general walked directly toward him. The white officers who'd been tormenting him daily fell silent. "Is that really you, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson?" the general asked, saluting sharply. The mop clattered from Walter's weathered hands as everyone gasped in disbelief. Before we dive into this incredible story of a forgotten hero, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to discover how a man treated as invisible became the most respected person on an entire military base overnight. Walter Jackson shuffled through the polished hallways of West Point Military Academy, his weathered hands gripping the handle of his cleaning cart with practiced ease. At 68 years old, his back ached from decades of bending and scrubbing, but his movements remained methodical and precise, much like they had been during his military days, though no one at the academy knew about that part of his life. Every day, Walter arrived at 5:30 in the morning, 15 minutes before his shift officially began, donning the grey janitor's uniform that seemed to render him invisible to most of the people around him. The cadets rushed past without acknowledging his presence, their boots creating scuff marks he would later remove. The white officers barely glanced his way, except when they needed something cleaned immediately. Walter had grown accustomed to this invisibility, had even come to prefer it in some ways, but the casual racism that accompanied it never ceased to sting. "Boy, you missed a spot," called out one of the younger officers as Walter mopped the bathroom floor. Walter was 40 years his senior, but the disrespect rolled off his back like water on wax. He simply nodded and returned to the spot, though it had already been perfectly clean. This particular evening, Walter worked late, cleaning the officers' lounge after hours. He thought the room was empty until the door swung open and 3 white officers strode in, laughing boisterously. They barely registered Walter's presence as they continued their conversation, dropping their coffee cups carelessly on the freshly polished table. "Can you believe they're pushing for more diversity initiatives?" scoffed one officer. "Standards will go right out the window." The tallest of the group, Major Reynolds, noticed Walter then. A smirk crossed his face as he deliberately knocked his coffee cup over, dark liquid spreading across the table and dripping onto the floor Walter had just cleaned. "Oops," he said, without a hint of remorse. "Guess the boy has more work to do." The others laughed as Walter silently retrieved his cloth and began cleaning up the mess. "Thank you, boy," Reynolds added with mock politeness. "At least you know your place." Walter's face remained impassive, though his heart hammered in his chest. The officers eventually left, and Walter finished his shift in silence, the encounter replaying in his mind. His hands trembled slightly as he locked up his cart, not from fear, but from the effort it took to contain his dignity in the face of such degradation. Later that night, Walter returned to his modest apartment on the outskirts of town. The walls were mostly bare, with no photographs or mementos visible in the living space. The only exception was a small cabinet in his bedroom that remained perpetually locked. Walter never opened it, never spoke of its contents. He heated a simple dinner and ate alone, as he did every night, before settling into an armchair to read military history books, his one indulgence. That night, like many others, Walter's sleep was disturbed by vivid nightmares. He woke suddenly, drenched in sweat, the echoes of gunfire and shouted orders from Vietnam still ringing in his ears. He sat on the edge of his bed, hands shaking, until his heart rate slowed. In all his 7 years working at West Point, Walter had only formed one meaningful connection. Darius Williams was a young black cadet in his 3rd year, bright and determined. With dreams of becoming a commanding officer, unlike the others, Darius saw Walter. He greeted him every morning, sometimes stopping to chat about his classes or training. Walter looked forward to these brief interactions, though he kept his responses measured and never revealed anything about his past. One morning, Darius found Walter earlier than usual, polishing the brass fixtures in the main hall. "Morning, Mr. Jackson," he said, his uniform crisp even at this early hour. "Mind if I ask you something?" Walter nodded, continuing his work. "I'm struggling with some of the officers here," Darius admitted, lowering his voice. "The way they look at me, talk down to me, like I don't belong here no matter how well I perform." He hesitated. "How do you deal with it? Being treated like you're nothing?" Walter paused, cloth in hand. He considered the young man before him, saw the familiar pain in his eyes. "You know who you are," Walter finally said, his voice quiet, but firm. "No one can take that from you unless you let them." Darius nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "There's a strength in silence sometimes," Walter continued, "but there's also a time to stand tall." He didn't elaborate further, didn't reveal how he had once stood tall in combat fatigues rather than a janitor's uniform, but something in his bearing, in the steel behind his gentle eyes, gave Darius pause. "You sound like you've been through the fire yourself, Mr. Jackson," Darius observed. Walter simply smiled faintly and returned to his polishing. "We all face our battles, son," he replied. "The question is whether we let them define us." As Darius walked away, Walter watched him, seeing in the young cadet a reflection of his own youth, his own struggles. And for a brief moment he wondered what might have been if he had made different choices after Vietnam, if he hadn't allowed himself to disappear into anonymity. But the moment passed, and Walter returned to his invisible existence, moving through the academy halls like a ghost, while the memories of a different life remained locked away, just like the cabinet in his bedroom. The announcement came over the academy intercom on a crisp autumn morning. General Marcus Thompson would be visiting West Point for a special ceremony honoring veterans of the Vietnam War. Walter, who had been dusting the trophy cases in the main hall, froze at the name, Marcus Thompson. The memories crashed over him like a tidal wave, helicopter rotors whipping overhead, the smell of jungle and gunpowder, Thompson's face, younger then, streaked with mud and blood as Walter dragged him to safety. For the first time in 7 years of employment, Walter called in sick. The administrative assistant sounded surprised over the phone, but didn't question him. Walter spent that day pacing his small apartment, anxiety coursing through his veins. He finally unlocked the cabinet he had kept sealed for decades. Inside lay neatly folded remnants of another life. A uniform with lieutenant colonel insignia, medals in velvet boxes, photographs of young men with guns and weary smiles. Walter picked up a particular photo, his Special Operations Unit, nicknamed the Ghost Squad for their ability to appear and disappear behind enemy lines without detection. In the center stood a younger version of himself, tall and proud in his uniform, surrounded by mostly white soldiers who followed his command despite the racial tensions of the era. His fingers traced the faces in the photograph. Johnson, Martinez, O'Brien, Cooper, all looking to him for leadership in the hellscape of Vietnam. He remembered their initial skepticism when he was assigned as their commanding officer, the thinly veiled comments, the reluctance to follow orders, until that mission, the one that changed everything. The memory was still vivid. Their helicopter, shot down behind enemy lines, communication equipment destroyed, surrounded by hostile forces. Walter had led them through 30 miles of dense jungle, evading capture, gathering intelligence, and ultimately discovering a massive weapons cache that would have been used against American forces. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Walter devised a strategy that not only secured the weapons, but also created a diversion that allowed a surrounded American battalion to retreat to safety. Hundreds of lives saved because of his quick thinking and leadership. When they finally reached American lines again, the soldiers who had once doubted him now looked at him with undisguised respect. There was talk of commendations, medals, recognition. Walter remembered the ceremony that was scheduled, then mysteriously postponed, then cancelled altogether. He remembered the paperwork that disappeared, the reports that were altered, the way his role was gradually minimized until it was barely a footnote. He remembered the white officer who received recognition for the mission's success, while Walter was quietly transferred to a desk job. Walter returned the items to the cabinet, but left it unlocked for the first time in years. After a restless night, he made a decision. He would return to work, despite the risk of being recognized by General Thompson. He couldn't hide forever, and in truth a part of him, a part long buried, wanted to be seen, to be acknowledged. When Walter arrived at the academy the next morning, the atmosphere was charged with excitement. Banners welcoming General Thompson hung in the main hall, and cadets and officers alike moved with an extra measure of precision and purpose. Walter kept his head down as he went about his duties, but he couldn't help overhearing snippets of conversation. The general extended his stay, one cadet told another, as Walter emptied a trash bin nearby. Supposed to leave yesterday, but he's still here. I heard he's looking for someone, replied the second cadet. Some soldier from his old unit. No one knows who. Walter's heart skipped a beat. He moved away quickly, his hands trembling slightly as he pushed his cart down the corridor. Could it be? After all these years? The academy buzzed with speculation about the general's unexpected extended stay. Some thought it was to evaluate the academy's leadership. Others suggested he was considering West Point for a special military program. No one suspected the truth, that a four-star general was searching for a janitor who walked invisibly among them. Throughout the day, Walter caught glimpses of General Thompson from afar, his silver hair, straight posture, the rows of medals on his chest. Each time, Walter managed to slip away before being noticed. But as the day wore on, he found himself wondering if he actually wanted to remain hidden. What would happen if he stood before his former comrade, no longer in a uniform, but in the grey coveralls of a maintenance worker? Would Thompson even recognize him after 40 years? And if he did, what then? As Walter polished the floor outside the administrative offices, he heard Thompson's voice from inside, deep in conversation with the academy superintendent. I've dedicated years to finding him, Thompson was saying. The records were deliberately obscured. Someone wanted his contributions erased. Walter slowed his movements, straining to hear more. If he's still alive, Thompson continued, I owe it to him to set the record straight. What happened wasn't just an oversight. It was a deliberate act of racism. And I was too young, too concerned with my own career to fight it at the time. Walter's heart pounded in his chest. After all these years, Thompson was still searching for him, still trying to right that long-ago wrong. For the first time in decades, Walter felt something stir within him, a spark of the man he used to be, the leader who commanded respect rather than the invisible servant who absorbed contempt. That night, alone in his apartment, Walter opened the cabinet again and took out his medals, not the official ones he'd been awarded, but the ones his men had given him privately, crafted from available materials in the field. To the best damn officer in Vietnam, read the crude inscription on the back of one. Walter held it in his palm, feeling its weight, remembering the night his squad had presented it to him after the mission that should have made him a hero. Tomorrow, he decided, tomorrow he would stop running from his past. The tension in the academy corridors felt electric the next morning as Walter pushed his cleaning cart past groups of whispering cadets and officers. Everyone seemed to be discussing General Thompson's extended stay and his mysterious search. Walter kept his head down, focusing on his tasks, when Major Reynolds approached with two junior officers in tow. "Jackson!" Reynolds barked, not bothering with any respectful address. "The donor reception area needs attention now." Walter nodded silently and changed direction, pushing his cart toward the grand reception hall where the academy would be hosting wealthy potential donors that afternoon. He could hear Reynolds snickering with his companions as they walked away. "That old man jumps like he's still got some sergeant barking orders at him," Reynolds said loudly enough for Walter to hear. "Probably never made it past private if he served at all." The irony of the statement might have been amusing if it didn't sting so sharply. Walter spent the next 2 hours meticulously preparing the reception hall, polishing every surface until it gleamed. As he was finishing, academy staff began arriving to set up refreshments and decorations for the event. Walter moved to leave, his work complete, when Reynolds reappeared with the academy's superintendent and several elegantly dressed civilians, the donors arriving early for a private tour. "This simply won't do," Reynolds announced loudly, gesturing to a spot on the floor that Walter had already cleaned twice. "Jackson, this floor is embarrassing. Clean it again." Walter stood still for a moment, aware of the donors watching the interaction with mild curiosity. The spot Reynolds indicated was immaculate. There was nothing to clean. But challenging him would only create a scene. Silently, Walter retrieved his mop and began cleaning the already spotless floor. "You see," At West Point, we demand perfection, Reynolds told the donors, speaking about Walter as if he weren't present. Even our maintenance staff must uphold certain standards. One of the donors, an older gentleman, frowned slightly at the display but said nothing. Walter continued mopping, his face betraying no emotion, even as humiliation burned within him. No, Reynolds said after a moment. That's still not right. Do it again, boy. The word hung in the air like a slap. A few of the donors shifted uncomfortably. Walter, now 68 years old, being called boy by a man young enough to be his son in front of distinguished guests. Maybe we should continue the tour, the superintendent suggested, clearly sensing the inappropriate nature of the situation. The hall looks fine to me. Just one moment, Reynolds insisted. Jackson needs to learn thoroughness. As Walter began a third cleaning of the spotless area, Darius Williams entered the hall carrying some paperwork for the event. He stopped short, taking in the scene with widening eyes. The young cadet's jaw tightened as he watched Walter being humiliated. "Sir," Darius addressed Reynolds formally, but with undisguised tension in his voice. "I believe Mr. Jackson has other areas requiring his attention." The maintenance supervisor was looking for him. Reynolds turned, his expression darkening at Darius's intervention. "Cadet Williams, was I speaking to you? Return to your duties immediately." "Sir, with respect," Darius persisted, "Mr. Jackson has completed his work here. The floor is clean." "Are you questioning my assessment, Cadet?" Reynolds' voice dropped dangerously. "No, sir," Darius replied, standing his ground despite the risk to his own position. "I'm simply relaying information from the maintenance supervisor." Walter straightened up, seeing the confrontation escalating. "It's all right, Darius," he said, quietly. "I don't mind." But something in Walter's posture had changed. He stood taller, his voice carrying a natural authority that made several people in the room, including the superintendent, look at him with sudden interest. Reynolds noticed too. "You're awfully familiar with this cadet, Jackson," he said suspiciously. "Remember your place." Walter met Reynolds' gaze directly for the first time. "My place," he repeated softly, years of military bearing momentarily visible in his stance. Reynolds blinked, taken aback by the unexpected show of dignity. "Get back to work," he snapped, turning to Darius. "And you, Cadet Williams, report to my office at 1600 hours. We'll discuss your inappropriate interruption then." As the tour group moved on, Walter caught Darius's eye and gave him a subtle shake of the head, urging restraint. When they were alone, Darius approached him. "That was wrong, Mr. Jackson. The way he treated you." "I've experienced worse," Walter replied, his voice steady. "But you shouldn't have intervened. He'll make trouble for you now." "I couldn't just watch," Darius said fiercely. "Do you ever get tired of it? Being treated like you're nothing when you're—" He stopped, frustration evident on his young face. "When I'm what?" Walter asked quietly. Darius shook his head. "I don't know. There's just something about you, sir. The way you carry yourself sometimes, like just now." Walter smiled faintly but said nothing as he packed up his cleaning supplies. Later that day, as his shift ended, Walter learned that Reynolds had placed Darius on disciplinary probation, citing insubordination and disruption of academy business. The punishment could potentially affect Darius's graduation and future assignments. That night, Walter sat in his apartment, turning in his hands the resignation letter he had drafted. Perhaps it was time to leave, to find some place where he wouldn't bring trouble to good people like Darius. A knock at his door surprised him. Opening it, he found Darius standing there in civilian clothes. "May I come in, Mr. Jackson?" Walter hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside. It was the first time anyone from the academy had visited his home. "Reynolds is pushing for my transfer," Darius said without preamble. "Says I don't have the right temperament for officer training." Walter sighed heavily, guilt weighing on him. "I'm sorry, son, this is my fault." "No," Darius said firmly. "It's the system's fault. The same system that lets men like Reynolds thrive while men like you—" He trailed off, looking around the sparse apartment with its single military history book open on the side table. "Mr. Jackson, can I ask you something personal?" Walter tensed but nodded. "Were you in the service?" Walter was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he finally said. "A lifetime ago." "Vietnam," Darius guessed, noticing how Walter's eyes flickered to the locked cabinet in the corner. Walter didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked, "Darius, how do you handle it? The disrespect, the extra scrutiny, the assumption that you don't belong?" "Some days better than others," Darius admitted, "but I keep thinking about the officers who'll come after me. If I quit, that's one less black officer to mentor them, to change things from the inside." The word struck Walter like a physical blow. Wasn't that exactly what he had failed to do? By disappearing into anonymity after Vietnam, hadn't he surrendered the chance to make things better for young men like Darius? That night, after Darius left, Walter unlocked the cabinet and fully examined its contents for the first time in decades. His fingers traced the lieutenant colonel insignia on his old uniform. The weight of his medals in his palm reminded him of who he had once been. The photographs showed a man who stood tall, who led, who made a difference. The flashbacks came, more frequently now, not just the traumatic moments of combat, but memories of leadership, of purpose, of respect earned through action rather than granted by privilege. As dawn broke, Walter made his decision. He would not resign. He would not run. Whatever came next, he would face it with the dignity and courage that had once made him Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jackson, commander of the Ghost Squad, hero of the Saigon Valley mission, not just Walter the janitor, invisible and dispensable. Do you think Walter should continue hiding his true identity, or should he finally stand up to Major Reynolds? Comment number 1 if you believe Walter should reveal who he really is and put Reynolds in his place. Or number 2 if you think he should keep his head down to protect Darius and his own peace. Like this video, if you've ever witnessed someone being mistreated because of their race or background, and subscribe to hear how Walter's incredible story continues. What do you think will happen when General Thompson finally finds the hero he's been searching for all these years? Stay tuned to find out how this military base is about to be changed forever. The next morning, Walter arrived at the academy earlier than usual, his mind still processing the decision he had made during his sleepless night. As he prepared his cleaning supplies, he overheard 2 officers discussing an all-hands meeting called by General Thompson for later that day. "Mandatory for all officers and senior cadets," one said. "Apparently it's about some special ops unit from Vietnam, the Ghost Squad or something." Walter's hands stilled on his mop. The Ghost Squad, his unit, his men. He had chosen this section of the academy to clean deliberately, knowing General Thompson would be meeting with senior staff in the adjacent conference room. Now, as he methodically worked his way down the corridor, he positioned himself near enough to hear through the partially open door. Inside, General Thompson stood at the head of a long table, surrounded by West Point's highest-ranking officers. His voice carried clearly into the hallway where Walter worked. "Gentlemen, I've been searching for 40 years for a man who should have been recognized as one of our greatest military heroes," Thompson began. "The leader of a unit known informally as the Ghost Squad, a special operations team that conducted some of the most successful missions of the Vietnam War." The officers listened attentively as Thompson continued, unaware of the janitor just outside, who had stopped mopping to hear every word. In May of 1971, this unit was shot down behind enemy lines near the Saigon Valley. Cut off from all support, their commanding officer led them through 30 miles of hostile territory. Along the way, they discovered a massive weapons cache and intelligence revealing a planned ambush against the American 7th Battalion. Thompson's voice grew more animated as he recounted the mission, Walter's mission. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, this officer developed and executed a strategy that not only secured the weapons cache, but created a diversion that allowed the surrounded 7th Battalion to retreat to safety. Hundreds of American lives were saved that day. Walter closed his eyes, transported back to that moment. The sweltering heat, the sound of distant artillery, the weight of responsibility for his men and for the battalion depending on them. "That officer should have received the Distinguished Service Cross at minimum," Thompson continued, his voice hardening. Instead, his accomplishments were systematically erased from official records. The citations disappeared. The commendations vanished, And a white officer who wasn't even present for the operation received recognition for its success. Murmurs of disbelief filled the room. "But how is that possible?" asked the academy superintendent. "Dozens of witnesses, official reports." "Deliberately buried," Thompson cut in. "I've spent decades piecing together what happened. The official records are mysteriously incomplete, pages missing, names redacted." Walter's heart pounded in his chest as he listened. All these years, he had believed he had been forgotten, his contributions deemed unworthy because of his race. He had never imagined that Thompson had been fighting to uncover the truth. "And who was this officer?" someone asked. There was a pause before Thompson responded. "Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jackson," he said, the name sending a jolt through Walter as he heard it spoken with such respect. "One of the finest officers I've ever known. A black man who led predominantly white troops with exceptional skill during a time of intense racial tension both at home and within the military itself." "And you believe he's still alive?" another voice asked. "I do," Thompson replied firmly. "My sources indicate he never left the country after his discharge. He would be in his late 60s now." "Why are you bringing this to West Point?" the superintendent inquired. "You think this Jackson might be here?" "I've been following leads for decades," Thompson explained. "His military records end abruptly after 1973, but I've traced civilian records that suggest he might be in this area. I'm checking every military installation, every veterans organization. If he's alive, I will find him and ensure he receives the recognition he deserves." Walter leaned against his mop, overwhelmed by the revelation. Thompson hadn't forgotten, had been searching for him all these years. The implications were staggering. "With all due respect, General," a new voice interjected. Major Reynolds, his tone skeptical. "It seems unlikely that a black officer could have led such a critical mission without proper recognition. Perhaps the records are incomplete because the story has been embellished over time." Walter stiffened at the familiar voice and the dismissive tone. "Are you suggesting I'm lying, Major?" Thompson asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "No, sir," Reynolds backpedaled quickly. "Just that memories can be imperfect after so many years. I have statements from 17 surviving members of the 7th Battalion," Thompson replied icily, "all confirming Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's actions. I have fragments of official reports that escaped redaction, and I have this." A silence fell over the room, and Walter wished desperately that he could see what Thompson was showing them. "My God," someone whispered. "Is that—" "The original citation for the Distinguished Service Cross," Thompson confirmed. "Signed and approved, then mysteriously lost before it could be awarded. I found it buried in archived files, misfiled under another operation entirely." Walter's hands trembled as memories flooded back. The mission had been a nightmare from the beginning. Their helicopter taking fire, crash landing in dense jungle, their radio operator killed instantly. Walter had taken command immediately, organizing the survivors, tending to the wounded, establishing their position with damaged equipment. They had been moving cautiously toward American lines when they discovered the weapons cache, a massive stockpile meant for a surprise attack on American forces. Walter's mind had worked quickly, formulating a plan that seemed impossible but was their only option. Using the enemy's own weapons, they had created a series of diversions that made their small unit seem like a much larger force. The gambit had worked, allowing the surrounded 7th Battalion to break free while also securing critical intelligence. When they finally reached American lines again, Walter's men, who had initially doubted him because of his race, now looked at him with undisguised respect and admiration. There had been talk of commendations, of medals, until suddenly there wasn't. "The question remains," the superintendent was saying, pulling Walter back to the present. "Why would someone go to such lengths to deny this officer recognition?" "Because Lieutenant Colonel Jackson was black," Thompson stated flatly, "and certain individuals in command were uncomfortable with a black officer receiving such high honors, particularly for leading white soldiers to safety. It contradicted the narrative they preferred." In the corridor, Walter was so absorbed in the conversation that he accidentally knocked his bucket, sending it clattering across the polished floor. The noise immediately silenced the discussion. In the conference room, Walter hurriedly righted the bucket, his heart racing as he heard chairs scraping inside. The door swung fully open, and Walter found himself face to face with the room full of officers, Major Reynolds among them. "Sorry for the disturbance, sirs," Walter mumbled, keeping his eyes downcast as he had learned to do over years of invisibility. But General Thompson was staring at him with an intensity that made Walter's skin prickle. "Wait," Thompson said, taking a step forward. "Look at me, please." Walter slowly raised his eyes, meeting Thompson's gaze directly for the first time in over 40 years. Recognition dawned in the general's eyes, confusion, disbelief, then absolute certainty. "My God," Thompson whispered. Walter Jackson." The room fell completely silent. Walter stood straight, no longer the hunched janitor, but suddenly every inch the military officer he had once been. "Hello, Marcus," he said quietly. "It's been a long time." And in that moment, as the officers stared in shock at the janitor they had ignored for years, Walter felt the weight of decades of invisibility finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. "Is that really you, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson?" General Thompson asked again, taking another step forward, his voice filled with disbelief and growing certainty. The mop clattered from Walter's weathered hands as he stood to his full height, shoulders squaring automatically in the presence of a superior officer, a posture that had been buried beneath years of deliberate invisibility but had never truly disappeared. "Yes, sir," Walter confirmed quietly, his voice stronger now, carrying the natural authority that he had suppressed for so long. General Thompson did something then that stunned everyone in the room. He snapped to attention and offered Walter a crisp, formal salute. "Sir," Thompson said, "it is an honor to finally find you." The conference room erupted in confused murmurs. Major Reynolds pushed his way forward, his face contorted with disbelief and denial. "This is absurd," he sputtered. "General, this man is a janitor. He's been cleaning toilets here for years. He can't possibly be—" "Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jackson," Thompson completed firmly, his eyes never leaving Walter's face. "Commander of Special Operations Unit 7, call sign Ghost Squad. One of the finest officers I've ever served with, and the man who saved my life along with hundreds of others during the Saigon Valley mission." The Academy Superintendent stepped forward, his expression bewildered as he looked between the janitor and the four-star general. "General Thompson, are you certain? This is Walter Jackson, our maintenance staff member for the past 7 years. "I've known this man's face every day for 40 years, Thompson replied. "I've been searching for him since 1973. There is no doubt in my mind." Walter stood perfectly still as the officers circled him, seeing him, truly seeing him for the first time. The weight of their stares pressed against him after so many years of invisibility. One of the older officers stepped closer, studying Walter's face. "My God," he breathed. "I was at Fort Benning in the early 70s. There was a photograph, a black lieutenant colonel who'd done something remarkable in Vietnam. It was you, wasn't it?" Walter nodded slightly but remained silent, the habit of discretion deeply ingrained. "This is preposterous," Reynolds insisted again. "If he's really who you claim, why would a decorated officer be working as a janitor? Why wouldn't he have said something?" Walter's eyes flickered to Reynolds. "Some battles aren't worth fighting, Major," he said quietly. "Or at least that's what I believed for many years." General Thompson placed a hand on Walter's shoulder. "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, I need to know. After your discharge, what happened? How did you end up here, working as—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the disbelief evident in his voice. Walter took a deep breath. "After the mission records were altered and my commendation disappeared, I was transferred to a desk job. My promotion to full colonel was denied without explanation. When I questioned it, I was informed that my temperament was unsuitable for higher command." Several officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the euphemism for what it was, a racist excuse to limit a black officer's advancement. "I served out my remaining time," Walter continued, "and was honorably discharged in 73. I tried to find work commensurate with my experience, but doors kept closing. No one would recognize my command experience. Recommendations that should have been glowing were strangely tepid. Eventually, I understood that the same forces that had buried my accomplishments in Vietnam were ensuring I wouldn't succeed in civilian life either. So you just gave up? Reynolds asked incredulously, still skeptical. Walter's eyes hardened. I survived, Major. I took the jobs I could get. I built a quiet life. And I watched younger men like Cadet Williams face the same battles I had. Fought, often with the same results. At the mention of Darius, several officers exchanged glances, the connection becoming clear. General, the superintendent interjected, perhaps we should move this discussion somewhere more private, and he glanced uncomfortably at Walter's janitor uniform, more appropriate to the circumstances. Thompson nodded. Lieutenant Colonel, Jackson, would you accompany us to my office? Walter hesitated, then nodded, leaving his mop and bucket behind as he followed the group of officers down the corridor. Cadets and staff stopped to stare as the unusual procession passed, the Academy's highest-ranking officers escorting a janitor with inexplicable deference. In Thompson's temporary office, Walter stood at parade rest out of ingrained habit until Thompson gestured to a chair. Sit, Walter, please. Once they were settled, Thompson addressed the room. Gentlemen, what I'm about to share was classified, until recently. He opened his briefcase and removed a weathered folder. This contains the fragments of the original mission reports that I've managed to piece together over the years. He turned to Walter. May 1971. Your helicopter was shot down behind enemy lines. Your radio operator, specialist. Garcia was killed instantly. Walter nodded, the memory crystal clear despite the decades. We had 4 wounded, including you, Marcus. Our position was compromised, enemy forces converging, no communication with base. Thompson turned to the other officers. What Lieutenant Colonel Jackson omits is that he treated my wounds himself, carried Sergeant Miller on his back for 15 miles, and still managed to lead us through hostile territory without losing a single additional man. Walter's expression remained impassive, but his mind filled with vivid images. Thompson's leg torn open by shrapnel, Miller delirious with fever from an infected wound, the oppressive jungle heat as Walter half-carried, half-dragged the sergeant through tangled underbrush. On the 3rd day, Thompson continued, we discovered an enemy weapons cache large enough to supply a major offensive. Intelligence documents at the site revealed plans for an ambush against the 7th Battalion, which was already in a vulnerable position with limited supply lines. We had a choice, Walter said quietly. Continue to American lines with our intelligence or attempt to warn the 7th and neutralize the threat. And Lieutenant Colonel Jackson chose the more difficult, more dangerous option, Thompson added. He developed a strategy using the enemy's own weapons to create the impression of a larger force, drawing attention away from the 7th while simultaneously alerting them to the danger. The superintendent leaned forward. How many men did you have, Colonel? 11 combat ready, Walter replied, against an estimated 200 enemy combatants. A low whistle escaped one of the younger officers. The diversion worked, Thompson continued. The 7th was able to withdraw to a defensible position. Meanwhile, we secured critical intelligence and destroyed weapons that would have been used against American forces. By any measure, it was an extraordinary achievement. Walter's gaze drifted to the window, seeing not the Academy grounds, but the jungle of Vietnam. We lost Cooper during the extraction, he said softly. He stepped on a mine while covering our retreat. Thompson nodded solemnly. Corporal James Cooper, the only casualty after the initial crash. He received a posthumous Silver Star. Walter's head snapped up. He did? I never knew. It was the only commendation from that mission that wasn't buried, Thompson explained. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's actions saved my life, the lives of our unit, and hundreds of men in the 7th Battalion, Thompson told the assembled officers. He should have received the Distinguished Service Cross at minimum. Instead, his achievements were systematically erased from the record, and Captain Howard Williams, who wasn't even in country at the time, received recognition for coordinating the operation from headquarters. Major Reynolds, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke up. If what you're saying is true, General, it's certainly regrettable. But it was 50 years ago. Surely, 50 years of injustice, Thompson cut him off sharply. 50 years of a hero being denied his rightful place in military history. 50 years of Lieutenant Colonel Jackson working menial jobs, while men with half his courage and capability advanced to positions of power and privilege. The superintendent's face had grown increasingly troubled as the story unfolded. "Colonel Jackson," he said, addressing Walter directly with his military rank for the first time, "I cannot express adequately how disturbing this is, to think that you've been working here under these conditions subjected to—" He trailed off, clearly remembering incidents of disrespect he had witnessed or heard about. Walter simply nodded, his expression carefully neutral. "What happens now?" one of the officers asked. Thompson looked at Walter. "That depends on what Lieutenant Colonel Jackson wants. The record can be corrected, the commendations awarded, even at this late date. Your rank and status can be officially recognized." Walter's mind raced. After decades of anonymity, of carefully constructed invisibility, the thought of stepping back into the light was both thrilling and terrifying. "I need time to process this," he said finally. "This wasn't how I expected my day to go when I reported for work this morning." A ghost of a smile crossed Thompson's face. "Understandable. But Walter, may I still call you Walter?" "You should. Know that I've spent 4 decades searching for you. Not just to right this wrong, but because the men you led never forgot you. The troops you saved remember. Your legacy has been awaiting its rightful acknowledgement for far too long." As the meeting concluded, arrangements were made for Walter to take paid leave, while decisions about next steps were formulated. The superintendent personally apologized for the treatment Walter had endured while working at the academy. As they left the office, Walter found himself face to face with Major Reynolds in the corridor. The Major's expression was unreadable, a mixture of disbelief, embarrassment, and lingering skepticism. "If this is true," Reynolds said stiffly, "then I apologize for my lack of respect." Walter studied the man who had tormented him daily, who had called him boy and spilled coffee deliberately for him to clean. In that moment, he could have exacted a measure of revenge, could have lauded his newly recognized status over Reynolds. Instead, he simply nodded. "Respect isn't about rank, Major," he said quietly. "It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of their uniform." As Walter walked away, head finally held high, he caught sight of Darius Williams, standing at the end of the corridor, watching with wide, disbelieving eyes as Walter was escorted out of the building, not as a janitor, but as a decorated military officer, finally receiving his due. The news spread through West Point Academy like wildfire. Walter Jackson, the elderly janitor who had moved invisibly through their hallways for 7 years, was actually Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jackson, a decorated Vietnam War hero whose accomplishments had been deliberately buried due to racial prejudice. By the following morning, when Walter arrived at the academy, not in his janitor's uniform but in civilian clothes at the superintendent's invitation, cadets and staff alike stopped to stare. Some nodded respectfully, others whispered behind their hands. Walter kept his posture straight, his gaze forward, the bearing of an officer that had never truly left him despite decades of forced humility. In the superintendent's office, Walter found General Thompson and several senior officers waiting. The atmosphere was cordial but tense. "Colonel Jackson," the superintendent began using Walter's military rank, "we've been discussing your situation. General Thompson has initiated the process to correct your military records and ensure you receive the commendations you earned. The Secretary of the Army has been briefed and is taking a personal interest." Walter nodded, still not entirely comfortable with this sudden shift in how he was addressed and treated. For decades he had been Jackson, or boy, or simply ignored altogether. "There's something else," Thompson added, his expression serious. "We believe you should share your story publicly. What happened to you wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of discrimination that affected countless black service members. Your testimony could help bring these historical injustices to light." Walter hesitated. Going public would mean completely abandoning the anonymity he had lived with for so long. It would mean facing questions, scrutiny, perhaps even hostility from those who preferred such historical injustices remain buried. Before he could respond, there was a commotion in the outer office. The door swung open, and Major Reynolds entered, accompanied by Colonel James Harrington, one of the most senior officers at the Academy. "Superintendent," Harrington said without preamble, "this situation requires further investigation before any public statements are made." Thompson frowned. "What situation, Colonel?" "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's identity has been confirmed to my satisfaction." "With respect, General," Harrington replied stiffly, "multiple officers have expressed concerns about potentially fraudulent claims. Major Reynolds has raised several discrepancies that warrant examination." Reynolds stepped forward, his expression a mixture of skepticism and barely concealed contempt. "Sir, we have only General Thompson's word and some fragmentary documents. If Jackson is who he claims to be, why has he spent 7 years as a janitor without mentioning his military background? Why would a decorated officer accept such a position?" Walter met Reynolds' gaze evenly. "When no one will honor your military. Experience, Major, you take whatever work you can get. I had bills to pay like anyone else." "Convenient," Reynolds snapped. "And what about your personnel records? I took the liberty of reviewing your employment file. There's no mention of military service on your application." "I stopped listing it decades ago," Walter replied quietly, "when it became clear that being a black officer was seen as a liability rather than an asset." The superintendent raised a hand to calm the escalating tension. "Major Reynolds, Colonel Harrington, your concerns are noted. However, General Thompson's identification could be mistaken," Harrington interrupted. "It's been 50 years. Memories fade. With respect to the General's distinguished service, we need more than memories and fragments to overturn historical records." Walter felt a familiar heaviness settling in his chest, the weight of disbelief of having his truth questioned simply because of his race. He had experienced this countless times before. "I propose," Harrington continued, "that we conduct a thorough investigation before making any official statements or initiating any changes to historical records. If Jackson is who he claims to be, the evidence will support it." Thompson's face had grown increasingly flushed with anger. "The evidence was deliberately buried, Colonel. That's the entire point of this situation." "Then we'll need to find new evidence," Harrington replied firmly. "In the meantime, I recommend discretion. No public statements, no changes to current arrangements." The implication was clear. Walter should return to his role as janitor until his identity was proven to their satisfaction. The meeting ended with a tense standoff, Thompson and the superintendent reluctantly agreeing to a brief investigation period, while Walter was placed on paid administrative leave. As Walter left the office, he found Darius waiting anxiously in the corridor. "Mr. Jackson, I mean Colonel Jackson," the young cadet stammered. "Is it true everything they're saying about you?" Walter sighed. "It's true, Darius, though some people still don't want to believe it." "But that's incredible," Darius said, his eyes wide with admiration. "You're a hero, sir, a legend." Walter smiled sadly. "Legends get remembered, son. I was erased." News of the controversy spread beyond the academy walls in the following days. Walter returned to his small apartment to find a local reporter waiting outside his door. "Colonel Jackson," the young woman called out, "is it true that your military achievements were covered up due to racial discrimination? How does it feel to finally be recognized after 50 years? Walter politely declined to comment, but by evening the story had hit local news outlets. Vietnam hero discovered working as janitor at West Point. The coverage was sympathetic but sensationalized, focusing on the shocking revelation and the dramatic moment of recognition. More troubling were the online comments that quickly accumulated beneath the articles, some supportive, but others openly skeptical or hostile. "Another race hoax," wrote one commenter. "If he was really a hero, someone would have recognized him before now." While public opinion was divided, within the academy, battle lines were clearly drawn. Reynolds led a faction of officers who questioned Walter's identity and opposed any effort to rewrite history based on what they called unsubstantiated claims. Thompson, meanwhile, continued to advocate fiercely for Walter's recognition, bringing in military historians and archivists to help piece together the fragmented record of his service. The investigation that Harrington had insisted upon quickly became contentious. Walter's personnel records from Vietnam were mysteriously incomplete, whole sections missing, reports truncated, commendation paperwork absent. "You see?" Reynolds argued during one heated meeting. If he was truly this decorated officer, there would be clear documentation. "That's exactly the point," Thompson countered angrily. "The documentation was deliberately removed or altered." "That's what we're trying to correct." Meanwhile, Walter found himself in an uncomfortable limbo, no longer the invisible janitor, not yet fully acknowledged as the officer he had been. He remained in his apartment, avoiding the media attention, and trying to process the sudden upheaval of his carefully constructed life. Darius visited regularly, bringing news from the academy and offering support. "The cadets are talking about nothing else," he reported. "A lot of us, especially the black cadets, were inspired by your story, sir. Reynolds and his crowd are in the minority." Walter appreciated the young man's loyalty, but worried about the potential impact on Darius's career. "Be careful, son," he warned. "Don't align yourself too publicly with me until this is resolved. Reynolds has influence." Darius straightened his shoulders. "With respect, sir, that's exactly the kind of thinking that allowed this injustice to continue for 50 years. No more hiding." The next day, Walter received disturbing news from Thompson. Someone had leaked Walter's home address to a fringe website that questioned his claims. That evening, Walter returned home to find his door vandalized with spray paint. "Stolen Valor," emblazoned in angry red letters across the entrance. Worse, when he entered, he discovered his apartment had been ransacked. The locked cabinet had been broken open, its contents scattered. His medals, the few personal ones his men had given him that weren't part of the official record, were gone. Photos of his unit had been torn to pieces. Walter stood in the midst of the destruction, a cold fury building within him. For decades, he had remained silent, had accepted the erasure of his contributions, had tolerated disrespect and invisibility. But this violation of his home, this destruction of the few mementos he had preserved from his service, this he could not abide. When Thompson arrived to survey the damage, he found Walter sitting calmly at his kitchen table, his weathered hands folded before him. "They took everything," Walter said quietly. "Every last piece of evidence I had." Thompson's face darkened with anger. "This isn't a coincidence. Someone wanted to eliminate whatever personal evidence you still possessed." "Reynolds? Perhaps, or someone supporting his position." Thompson sat across from Walter. "This changes things. We need to accelerate our efforts before more damage is done." Walter nodded slowly. "I've been silent for 50 years, Marcus. I didn't fight when they buried my accomplishments. I didn't protest when they denied my promotion. I accepted invisibility because it seemed easier than battling a system designed to erase men who looked like me." His eyes met Thompson's, and there was steel in them now. "I'm done being silent." Do you think Walter should have spoken up years ago when his achievements were first erased, or was he right to protect himself by staying silent? Comment number 1, if you believe he should have fought the system from the beginning, or number 2, if you think his silence was a necessary survival strategy. Like this video if you're inspired by Walter's courage to finally reclaim his identity after decades of erasure. Subscribe to see how Walter will fight back against those trying to silence him once again. Will General Thompson be able to find the evidence needed to prove Walter's heroism, or will Reynolds and his allies succeed in burying the truth forever? The battle for Walter's legacy is just beginning. 3 days after the break-in at Walter's apartment, General Thompson arrived at Walter's temporary accommodations, a secure guest suite on the academy grounds, with unexpected news. "We're having visitors today," Thompson announced, his eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "Special visitors who've traveled a considerable distance to see you." Walter looked up from the military history book he'd been reading. "Who?" he asked, caution evident in his voice after days of skepticism and backlash. "You'll see," Thompson replied with a rare smile. "Just be in the superintendent's conference room at 1400 hours. The morning passed slowly for Walter, his mind cycling through possibilities. Perhaps military historians, Pentagon officials, journalists. He dressed carefully in the new civilian clothes Thompson had arranged for him, after most of his possessions had been damaged in the break-in. At precisely 2 o'clock, Walter entered the conference room to find Thompson waiting with the superintendent and several high-ranking officers. Major Reynolds was notably absent. "Colonel Jackson," the superintendent greeted him formally. "Your guests have just cleared security. They'll be here momentarily." Before Walter could respond, the door opened again. A group of elderly men entered, 5 of them, all in their 70s, all moving with the slight stiffness of age, but with military bearing still evident in their posture. Walter stared at them, recognition dawning slowly. "My God," he whispered. Thompson stepped forward. "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, I believe you know these gentlemen." The tallest of the visitors, a white-haired man with piercing blue eyes, stepped forward. "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "Sergeant James O'Brien reporting for duty, sir." Another man moved to stand beside him. "Corporal Michael Davis, sir." One by one, they introduced themselves. 5 surviving, members of Walter's Ghost Squad, men he had commanded in Vietnam, men he had led through jungle and firefights, men whose lives he had saved. Men he hadn't seen in 50 years. "O'Brien," Walter said, reaching out to grasp the first man's hand. "Davis, Martinez, Wilson, Miller." His voice faltered as he named each of them, memories flooding back. "You're all alive. You're all here." O'Brien, who had been Walter's second-in-command, nodded solemnly. "When General Thompson contacted us about you, wild horses couldn't have kept us away, sir." The room fell quiet as the elderly veterans surrounded their long-lost commander, half a century of separation evaporating in an instant. There were tears in the eyes of hardened men who had faced death together in the jungles of Vietnam, who had trusted one another with their lives, who had formed bonds that transcended time and distance. The superintendent discreetly suggested that the official officers leave the room to give the reunited squad privacy. When the door closed behind them, O'Brien turned to Walter. "Sir, we never forgot you. Never. When they transferred you out, after the mission, when your commendation disappeared, we knew something was wrong. We protested, but we were just enlisted men. No one listened." Miller, who had been the squad's medic, nodded in agreement. "They told us you had requested the transfer. We knew it was a lie. After we all mustered out," Martinez added, "we tried to find you, but it was like you'd disappeared." Walter nodded slowly. "In a way, I did disappear. After fighting the system for a few years and getting nowhere, I decided it was easier to just fade away." "But, sir," Wilson interjected, "you saved all our lives. You saved the entire 7th Battalion. How could they just erase that?" "The same way they erased a lot of things black soldiers did in every war," Walter replied simply, "by making sure it never made it into the official record." O'Brien's face darkened. "We knew it was because you were black, sir. It wasn't right then, and it's not right now. General Thompson says some people here are claiming you're an imposter," Davis said incredulously. "That's why we're here, to set the record straight." The afternoon stretched into evening as the reunited ghost squad shared memories, filled in the gaps of 50 years of separate lives, and strategized about the present situation. Walter learned that O'Brien had become a police officer after Vietnam, Davis a teacher, Martinez a small business owner. Wilson had stayed in the military until retirement as a master sergeant. Miller had become a doctor. All had built lives, raised families grown old, carrying with them the memory of their commander and the injustice done to him. "There's something else you should know, sir," O'Brien said as their conversation turned serious again. "About Major Reynolds." Walter raised an eyebrow. "What about him?" "His father was Colonel Richard Reynolds," O'Brien explained, "the officer who intercepted your commendation paperwork and buried it." Walter stared at him in shock. "Reynolds? Are you certain?" "Positive, sir. Colonel Reynolds was on the review board for commendations. He was known for his views on integration in the officer corps. When we started investigating what happened to your paperwork back in '71, his name kept coming up. So Major Reynolds is continuing his father's work," Walter said quietly, the pieces falling into place. "Maintaining the erasure." "It's worse than that," Thompson interjected. "Since our last meeting, I've discovered that Reynolds has been actively interfering with our investigation. Files that were available a week ago have suddenly been misplaced. Witnesses have been discouraged from coming forward. The revelation of this deliberate, ongoing attempt to suppress the truth ignited a new determination in Walter. The systematic discrimination that had buried his achievements wasn't just a historical wrong. It was actively continuing, perpetuated by a new generation. The next morning, Walter and his former squad members, accompanied by General Thompson, entered a special hearing convened by the Academy Superintendent. Major Reynolds was present, along with Colonel Harrington and several other skeptical officers. Their expressions ranged from surprise to dismay at the sight of the 5 veterans flanking Walter. "Gentlemen," the superintendent began, "this hearing has been called to address the questions surrounding Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jackson's military service and accomplishments. We have special witnesses today who have traveled here specifically to provide testimony." One by one, the members of the Ghost Squad stepped forward to give their accounts of the Saigon Valley mission, of Walter's leadership, of the lives he had saved, and of the subsequent cover-up of his achievements. Their testimony was powerful, detailed, and consistent. 5 separate witnesses, all confirming the same facts, all identifying Walter without hesitation as their commanding officer. Reynolds shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the testimony mounted. When O'Brien directly named Reynolds's father as the officer responsible for burying Walter's commendation, the major's face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "You can't possibly remember such details after 50 years. And even if my father was on that review board, there would have been legitimate reasons." "We have more than memories, Major," Thompson interrupted, placing a folder on the table. "While your associates were busy removing evidence from current files, I was working with the National Archives. These are the original deployment records for Ghost Squad, confirming Lieutenant Colonel Jackson as commanding officer." He placed another folder beside it. "And these are the after-action reports filed by multiple officers from the 7th Battalion, all crediting their rescue to a black lieutenant colonel named Walter Jackson." Reynolds opened his mouth to object again, but Thompson wasn't finished. "And finally," he said, removing a small device from his pocket, "this was recovered from the military film archive last week. It was mislabeled and buried, but it exists." He placed the device, a digital video player, on the table and pressed play. The screen lit up with grainy black and white footage. Despite the poor quality, the images were clear enough. A military debriefing session dated May 1971. A younger Walter Jackson in full uniform with lieutenant colonel insignia stood at a map, pointing out positions as he detailed the mission. Around him sat officers taking notes, including a visibly younger Marcus Thompson. "This footage was supposed to be part of the commendation record," Thompson explained. "It mysteriously disappeared from the file before the final review. I've spent decades searching for it." The room fell silent as they watched Walter on screen, his authority evident in every gesture, every word. Even Colonel Harrington appeared, stunned by this irrefutable evidence. When the footage ended, the superintendent looked at Reynolds. "Major, do you have any further objections to recognizing Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's identity and accomplishments?" Reynolds's jaw worked silently for a moment before he managed to respond. "No, sir," he said stiffly. "It appears I was misinformed about certain aspects of this situation." The victory was overwhelming. With the testimony of Walter's former squad members, the recovered documentation, and the archival footage, there could no longer be any doubt about Walter's identity or achievements. Public opinion, already leaning in Walter's favor, shifted dramatically as news outlets reported on the reunion of the Ghost Squad and the discovery of the suppressed evidence. The Academy was forced to confront not only the historical injustice done to Walter, but also the contemporary manifestations of institutional racism that had allowed Reynolds and others to nearly succeed in perpetuating that injustice. For Walter, the validation was both sweet and painful. Sweet because the truth he had known for 50 years was finally acknowledged. Painful because of all the lost decades, all the opportunities denied, all the respect withheld. As he sat in his temporary quarters that evening, surrounded by his Former squad members sharing stories and bourbon, Walter felt a complex mixture of emotions: vindication, grief, relief, and a strange sense of displacement. For so long he had been invisible by necessity. Now suddenly all eyes were upon him. The transition was jarring. "What will you do now, sir?" O'Brien asked as the evening wound down. Walter considered the question carefully. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "For 50 years my goal was simply to survive with my dignity intact. But I never imagined this." Martinez raised his glass. "Whatever you decide, sir, we're with you. All the way." Walter looked around at these men, white men who had once doubted him because of his race, but had come to respect him through his actions, men who had spent decades carrying the memory of his leadership while he languished in obscurity. Their loyalty humbled him. "First," he said resolutely, "I'm going to make sure the record is set straight, not just for me, but for every black service member whose contributions have been minimized or erased. This isn't just my story. It's a pattern that needs to be exposed and corrected." The others nodded in solemn agreement. "And second," Walter continued, his eyes finding Darius Williams, who had joined them late in the evening, "I'm going to make sure the next generation doesn't have to fight the same battles we did. It's time to break the cycle." As the evening concluded and his visitors departed, Walter stood at the window of his quarters, looking out at the academy grounds. Somewhere out there was Major Reynolds, facing the collapse of his efforts to maintain his father's racist legacy. Somewhere were the cadets like Darius, watching these events unfold and drawing their own conclusions about justice, truth, and perseverance. And somewhere, Walter knew, were other forgotten heroes like himself, men and women whose contributions had been minimized or erased because of their race, gender, or background. Tomorrow would bring the formal hearing to review his service record, to officially acknowledge what the evidence had already proven beyond doubt. Walter would stand before a military panel and recount his story. Not just the heroism in Vietnam, but the systematic discrimination that followed, the deliberate erasure of his achievements, the decades of invisibility. It would not be easy to relive those painful chapters. But for the first time in 50 years, Walter Jackson would speak his truth knowing that it would be heard, recorded, and acknowledged. For the first time, he would be truly visible. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, sunlight glinting off the Academy's historic buildings as Walter prepared himself for what would undoubtedly be one of the most significant days of his life. He dressed with care in the new suit Thompson had arranged for him, charcoal grey with a subtle pinstripe, professional and dignified. His hands, weathered from years of manual labor, trembled slightly as he fastened his tie. A knock at his door revealed Thompson, already in full dress uniform, medals glinting on his chest. "Ready for this?" the general asked, studying Walter's expression. "As ready as I'll ever be," Walter replied, squaring his shoulders. The military panel convened in West Point's most formal conference room, a space typically reserved for visiting dignitaries and high-level strategic meetings. 7 senior officers sat at a long table, their expressions serious and attentive. Behind them, rows of chairs had been arranged for observers. Walter's former squad members in the front row, followed by selected academy officers, cadets, including Darius, and a handful of military historians and archivists who had helped uncover the documentation supporting Walter's case. Major Reynolds sat stiffly in the back row, his presence required but his influence now diminished. The superintendent opened the proceedings with a brief statement, acknowledging the unusual nature of the hearing. "We are gathered today to review the service record of Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jackson and to determine appropriate recognition for his actions during the Vietnam War, particularly regarding the Saigon Valley mission of May 1971. This hearing follows the discovery of substantial evidence indicating that Colonel Jackson's achievements were deliberately omitted from official records due to racial discrimination." Walter sat at a smaller table facing the panel, Thompson beside him as his advocate. As the proceedings began, various witnesses were called. First, the surviving members of Ghost Squad, who once again recounted Walter's leadership during the mission that saved hundreds of American lives. Their testimony was detailed and powerful, describing not only Walter's tactical brilliance, but also his courage under fire, his unwavering care for his men, and his calm authority in the face of overwhelming odds. Several officers from the 7th Battalion, now elderly men in their 70s and 80s, had provided written statements that Thompson read aloud, all crediting their survival to Walter's actions. Military historians presented the recovered documentation, explaining how records had been altered, paperwork lost, and Walter's role systematically minimized in official accounts. When it was Major Reynolds's turn to speak, he approached the podium with visible reluctance. "In light of the evidence presented," he said stiffly, "I withdraw any objections to recognizing Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's service. Furthermore," he continued, his jaw tight, "I wish to personally apologize for any role my father may have played in the suppression of Colonel Jackson's rightful commendations and for my own resistance to correcting this historical wrong." The apology was clearly difficult for him, likely compelled by his superiors rather than offered willingly, but it represented another small victory in Walter's long-delayed journey toward recognition. Finally, it was Walter's turn to address the panel. He rose slowly, the room falling completely silent as he approached the podium. He stood tall, his bearing unmistakably military despite the decades since he had worn a uniform. "Distinguished members of the panel," he began, his voice steady and clear. 50 years ago, I led a mission that saved American lives. I did this not for recognition or medals, but because it was my duty as an officer and as a leader of men. What followed that mission, however, was not about duty or service or merit. It was about the color of my skin. Walter recounted his experiences after Vietnam, the transfer to a desk job, the commendation that never materialized, the promotion denied without explanation. He described his attempts to address these injustices through official channels, all of which were rebuffed or ignored. "After my discharge in 1973, Walter continued, I discovered that the discrimination I faced wasn't limited to my military career. Civilian employers who initially seemed interested would suddenly become distant when they learned I had been a commanding officer. References that should have been exemplary were strangely lukewarm. Doors that should have been open remained firmly closed." He described the gradual erosion of his expectations, the slow acceptance of a life far below what his abilities and experience should have earned him. "Eventually," he said quietly, "I stopped listing my military service on job applications altogether. I found it easier to be seen as a man with limited education and experience than to face the disbelief and dismissal that came with being a black officer who had commanded white troops." The psychological toll of this erasure was evident in Walter's voice, as he described decades of living as less than he was, of suppressing his knowledge and leadership abilities, of accepting disrespect from people who would have saluted him, had they known his true identity. The hardest part, he admitted, wasn't the missed opportunities or the financial struggles. It was watching the same patterns of discrimination continue, generation after generation, seeing young men like Cadet Williams facing the same barriers, the same stereotypes, the same systematic diminishment that I had faced. He turned slightly to acknowledge Darius in the audience. "My greatest regret is not fighting harder, not standing up sooner, not for myself but for those who came after me. By accepting invisibility, I may have inadvertently perpetuated the very system that erased me." Walter's honesty about his own choices and regrets lent profound weight to his testimony. This wasn't just about correcting a historical injustice. It was about acknowledging the complex human cost of discrimination, how it forced impossible choices between dignity and survival, between fighting a corrupt system and finding ways to exist within it. "I don't stand before you seeking personal glory," Walter concluded. "What was taken from me, 50 years of the life I should have had, cannot be restored, but the truth can and should be acknowledged. Not just for me, but for every service member whose contributions have been minimized or erased because of race, gender, or background. The historical record should reflect reality, not prejudice." As Walter returned to his seat, the room remained silent for several long moments. Even the most stoic officers on the panel appeared moved by his testimony. Outside the hearing room, word of Walter's powerful statement spread quickly across the academy. Cadets gathered in small groups, discussing the implications of what was unfolding. For many of the black cadets, Walter's story resonated deeply with their own experiences of having to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Darius organized an impromptu gathering outside the building, where the hearing was taking place. Dozens of cadets, particularly those from minority backgrounds, standing in silent support of Walter and what his case represented. Inside, the panel had begun its deliberations. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies consistent, the documentation, though fragmented, compelling. Yet there remained an unspoken resistance from some quarters, not to acknowledging Walter's achievements, which were now undeniable, but to admitting the deliberate, systematic nature of their suppression. To fully recognize Walter's case would mean acknowledging a pattern of institutional racism that extended far beyond one man's experience. As the deliberations continued behind closed doors, Walter waited with Thompson and his former squad members in an adjoining room. The hours stretched on, tension building as the panel wrestled not just with Walter's individual case, but with its broader implications. "What's taking so long?" Martinez wondered aloud after the third hour. "The evidence is clear-cut." O'Brien shook his head knowingly. "They're not debating whether the colonel deserves recognition. They're debating how much of the wrongdoing to admit to." Walter nodded in agreement. "Acknowledging my service is one thing. Acknowledging that it was deliberately suppressed because of racism is another entirely. That opens doors they may not want opened." Thompson's expression was grim. "There are still those who believe some aspects of military history should remain selectively remembered." Finally, after nearly 5 hours of deliberation, they were called back into the hearing room. The panel members had returned, their expressions unreadable as Walter and his supporters took their seats. The head of the panel, a 3-star general named Harris, cleared his throat before speaking. "This panel has reviewed all testimony and evidence regarding Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jackson's service record, with particular attention to his command of Special Operations Unit 7, call sign Ghost Squad, and his actions during the Saigon Valley mission of May 1971. The room held its collective breath as Harris continued. "Based on this review, we have reached the following conclusions. First, that Lieutenant Colonel Jackson demonstrated exceptional leadership, tactical brilliance, and personal courage during the mission in question, directly resulting in the salvation of hundreds of American lives. Second, that the subsequent failure to recognize these achievements through appropriate commendations represents a grievous error in the military record." Walter tensed at the word error, a neutral term that avoided acknowledging the deliberate nature of what had happened. Harris seemed to sense this reaction. After a slight pause, he added, "Further, this panel acknowledges that this error appears to have been intentional and motivated by racial prejudice prevalent at that time, representing a serious injustice. Yet Lieutenant Colonel Jackson and a failure to uphold the military's core values of honor and integrity." A murmur ran through the room at this admission, more direct than many had expected. Harris wasn't finished. "Finally, we recognize that this case is likely not isolated, but rather representative of a pattern of similar injustices that may have affected other service members from minority backgrounds throughout our military history." He looked directly at Walter now. "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, on behalf of the United States Army, I extend a formal apology for the injustice you experienced and the decades of recognition denied to you. This panel unanimously recommends the immediate correction of your service record, the awarding of all commendations originally recommended, including the Distinguished Service Cross and the restoration of your full rank and honors." Walter sat perfectly still, absorbing words he had never expected to hear. Around him, his former squad members exchanged triumphant glances. Thompson placed a supportive hand on his shoulder, but Harris had one final announcement. "Additionally, in recognition of the unique nature of this case and its significance to our ongoing efforts to address historical inequities within the military, this panel recommends that Lieutenant Colonel Jackson be offered a position as Special Advisor on Diversity and Historical Reconciliation here at West Point Military Academy, should he wish to accept such a role." This unexpected offer sent another ripple of reaction through the audience. Walter himself was caught completely off guard. From janitor to honored advisor, The transformation was almost too dramatic to comprehend. As the hearing concluded, Walter found himself surrounded by well-wishers, his former squad members, Thompson, Darius, and other cadets, even some of the panel members themselves. Hands reached out to shake his, voices offered congratulations and long-overdue respect. Through it all, Walter maintained his composure, accepting the recognition with the same quiet dignity with which he had endured its absence for so many years. But inside, a complex storm of emotions raged, vindication mixed with grief for all the lost years, satisfaction at the truth finally acknowledged, uncertainty about the path ahead, and a growing sense of responsibility to use this platform to address the systemic issues his case had exposed. As he left the building, Walter was surprised to find dozens of cadets standing in formation outside, Darius at their head. As Walter emerged, they snapped to attention in perfect unison, offering a formal salute to the officer who had been invisible among them for so long. Walter returned their salute with precision that belied the decades since he had last performed the gesture, his eyes meeting Darius's with shared understanding of what this moment represented, not just for Walter himself, but for every person who had ever been dismissed, diminished, or rendered invisible because of prejudice. The truth had finally broken through half a century of deliberate suppression. Walter Jackson was invisible no more. 6 months after the hearing that changed everything, Walter Jackson stood before a mirror in his new quarters at West Point Academy, adjusting the uniform he had never expected to wear again. The lieutenant colonel insignia gleamed on his shoulders, polished to perfection. The Distinguished Service Cross, finally awarded after 50 years, hung prominently among the row of medals on his chest. His reflection showed a man transformed, not just by the uniform, but by the restoration of his identity, his purpose, his visibility. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," Walter called, his voice carrying the natural authority that had been suppressed for decades. General Thompson appeared, resplendent in his own dress uniform. "Ready for the ceremony, Walter?" Walter nodded, taking one last look at his reflection. "As ready as I'll ever be." The journey to this moment had been extraordinary. Following the panel's decision, Walter's case had gained national attention. Military historians began re-examining other instances of minority service members whose contributions might have been similarly erased. The Secretary of the Army had personally overseen the correction of Walter's records and the awarding of his long-delayed commendations in a private ceremony attended by his former squad members. Major Reynolds, his credibility damaged by his attempts to suppress the truth, had been quietly transferred to a remote post far from West Point. His office, once a place where he had summoned Walter to perform menial cleaning tasks, had been reassigned to Walter himself as part of his new position as Special Advisor on Diversity and Historical Reconciliation. The irony was not lost on anyone. Walter had accepted the position after careful consideration, recognizing the opportunity to transform his personal vindication into systemic change. His first initiative had been the creation of a comprehensive review of historical military records, searching for other instances where achievements by minority service members might have been minimized or erased. His second had been the establishment of a mentorship program specifically for cadets from underrepresented backgrounds, a program he named Visibility Initiative. Today marked the official launch of that program, with a formal ceremony that would introduce it to the entire academy. As Walter and Thompson walked toward the parade ground where the ceremony would take place, cadets and officers alike stopped to salute. Walter returned each salute crisply, still adjusting to being seen, truly seen after so many years of invisibility. "Nervous?" Thompson asked as they approached the gathering crowd. Walter smiled slightly. "I led men into combat, Marcus. I think I can handle a speech." But the truth was more complex. For decades, Walter had moved through the world trying not to be noticed. Now he would be standing before hundreds of people, all eyes upon him, his words carrying the weight of official recognition and authority. The transformation was still disorienting at times. The parade ground was filled to capacity, not just with cadets and officers, but with media representatives, military officials from Washington, and Walter's former squad members seated in places of honor. Darius Williams, now in his final year at the academy and thriving under Walter's mentorship, stood at attention with the other cadets selected for the inaugural cohort of the Visibility Initiative. The superintendent approached the podium first, welcoming the assembled crowd and outlining the purpose of the ceremony. He spoke eloquently about the Academy's commitment to rectifying historical injustices and ensuring that all cadets, regardless of background, would have equal opportunities to be recognized for their achievements and contributions. Then General Thompson took the stage to formally introduce Walter, not as a janitor, not as a forgotten hero, but as Lieutenant Colonel Walter Jackson, decorated Vietnam veteran and the Academy's new special advisor. "When I first recognized Walter Jackson in these halls 6 months ago," Thompson began, "he was holding a mop instead of receiving the salutes he had earned. That moment represented not just an individual injustice, but a systemic failure that has affected countless service members throughout our history." Thompson went on to describe the deliberate erasure of Walter's achievements, the 50 years of invisibility, and the recent efforts to correct the historical record. "But Lieutenant Colonel Jackson's story is not just about the past," Thompson continued. "It's about the future we are creating together, a future where no service member's contributions will be minimized or erased because of race, gender, or background. A future where excellence is recognized regardless of who exhibits it." As Thompson yielded the podium, Walter stepped forward. The crowd fell silent, all eyes on the man who had moved among them unseen for so long. "6 months ago," Walter began, his voice clear and strong, "I was invisible. For 50 years, I accepted that invisibility as the price of survival in a world that wasn't ready to see a black man as a leader, a hero, a savior of American lives." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled cadets. "But invisibility comes at a cost, not just to those who are rendered unseen, but to the institutions and the nation that lose the full measure of their contributions." Walter spoke without notes, drawing on decades of unspoken thoughts and observations. He described the systematic ways in which minority achievements had been minimized throughout military history, not as accusations, but as historical facts that needed to be acknowledged before they could be addressed. "The Visibility Initiative we launched today," Walter explained, "is not about special treatment. It's about equal recognition, ensuring that excellence is seen, acknowledged, and rewarded regardless of who exhibits it. It's about creating a military where no one has to choose between their identity and their advancement, where no achievement is erased because of who accomplished it." He outlined the program's 3 core components: the historical review to identify and correct past erasures, the mentorship program pairing minority cadets with successful officers from similar backgrounds, and a new set of protocols for ensuring that commendations and promotions were evaluated based solely on merit. "This initiative honors not just my story," Walter continued, "but the stories of countless others, whose names we may never know, those who served with distinction, but whose contributions were diminished or erased. Their invisible sacrifices paved the way for the changes we see today." As Walter concluded his address, he turned to the cadets participating in the inaugural cohort of the program, Darius among them. "To the young men and women who will carry this forward, your achievements will not be invisible. Your excellence will not be denied. Your contributions will be recognized for their full value. That is my promise to you, and the promise of this institution as we move forward together." The applause was thunderous as Walter stepped back from the podium. The superintendent returned to announce that the Academy's new Diversity Center would bear Walter's name, a permanent recognition of his story and its significance. In the reception that followed, Walter moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and engaging with cadets eager to share their own experiences. He found particular satisfaction in introducing his former squad members to the young cadets, creating connections across generations of service. As the event wound down, Walter found a quiet moment with Darius. "Sir," the young cadet said, his expression earnest, "I can't express what it means to have you here, not just as a mentor, but as living proof that excellence can't be permanently erased. That truth eventually finds its way to the light." Walter smiled, placing a hand on Darius's shoulder. What matters isn't just that my truth finally emerged, son. What matters is ensuring that your generation never has to fight for basic recognition the way mine did. That's the real victory. Here." Later that evening, Walter returned to his office, the same space where Major Reynolds had once berated cadets and ordered Walter to clean already spotless floors. Now the walls displayed Walter's restored service records, photographs of Ghost Squad, and the official citation for his Distinguished Service Cross. On his desk sat a box containing something especially meaningful, the personal medals, and photographs that had been stolen during the break-in at his apartment, recovered during the investigation, and returned to him intact. As Walter settled behind his desk to review applications for the next cohort of the Visibility Initiative, he heard a knock at his open door. Looking up, he was surprised to see a young black cadet he didn't recognize, a first year by the look of him, still adjusting to academy life. "Lieutenant Colonel Jackson," the cadet asked hesitantly. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir." Walter gestured for him to enter. "Not at all, cadet. What can I do for you?" The young man stood at attention. "Sir, I just wanted to thank you personally. Last week I was feeling pretty discouraged about some things here. Then I was assigned to polish the display cases in the main hall, and I saw your photograph, the one that tells your story." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "And then I realized that the quiet man who had encouraged me earlier that same day, when I was struggling with drill, was actually you, the hero from the display." Walter remembered the brief interaction, a moment of connection with a young cadet who had reminded him of Darius, a few words of encouragement offered naturally, without thought of his new position or status. "What's your name, cadet?" Walter asked. "James Cooper, sir," the young man replied. Walter felt a jolt of recognition, the same name as the corporal from his unit who had sacrificed his life covering their retreat. "Any relation to James Cooper, who served in Vietnam? Special operations?" The cadet's face lit up. "Yes, sir, he was my grandfather's brother. My grandfather told me stories about him my whole life, how he served under a black officer who was the finest leader in Vietnam, how that officer was never properly recognized because of racism in the military." Walter sat back, momentarily speechless at this connection across time and generations. "Your great-uncle was a hero, Cadet Cooper. He gave his life saving our entire unit." The young man nodded solemnly. "That's why I came to West Point, sir, to honor his memory, and now to learn from you the officer he believed in." As Cadet Cooper left, Walter turned to the window, looking out at the academy grounds where future military leaders were being shaped. For 50 years, he had believed his contributions had been permanently erased, his legacy denied. Now, in ways he could never have imagined, that legacy was not only restored but amplified, touching lives, changing systems, creating ripples that would extend far beyond his own story. The Invisible Man had become a beacon, illuminating a path toward a military where excellence would be recognized, regardless of who exhibited it, where no achievement would be erased because of prejudice, where no service member would have to choose between their identity and their advancement. After decades of erasure and invisibility, Walter Jackson had reclaimed not just his own honor, but helped create space for others to receive the recognition they deserved, and in doing so, he had transformed a personal injustice into institutional change that would benefit generations to come. What's your reaction to Walter's incredible journey from invisibility to recognition? Has someone in your life ever been underestimated or overlooked because of who they are? Comment below with your thoughts and experiences. If Walter's story of perseverance and dignity in the face of discrimination inspired you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more powerful stories of unsung heroes. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that the truth eventually comes to light, no matter how long it takes. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey of reclaiming honor and creating lasting change. Walter Jackson's journey teaches us that dignity cannot be permanently erased, even when systems try to render us invisible. His story shows how institutional racism can rob individuals not just of recognition, but of their very identity and purpose. Yet it also demonstrates that truth, though delayed, eventually finds its way to the light. The most powerful lesson is how Walter transformed personal injustice into systemic change. Rather than seeking mere personal vindication, he created pathways for future generations to avoid the struggles he endured. His story reminds us that there are countless unsung heroes whose contributions have been minimized or erased because of prejudice, and that acknowledging these historical injustices is essential to creating a more equitable future. Walter's quiet dignity during decades of disrespect teaches us about the different forms resistance can take. Sometimes standing tall means surviving with inner integrity intact until the moment is right to reclaim your full identity. Perhaps most importantly, Walter's reconnection with his former squad members shows that authentic respect transcends racial barriers, and that bonds forged through shared purpose and mutual recognition of humanity can withstand even the most deliberate attempts to erase them. Has someone in your life ever been denied recognition they deserved because of discrimination? Have you witnessed the quiet dignity of someone who maintained their inner strength despite being treated as invisible? Share your reflections in the comments below. If Walter's 50-year journey from erasure to acknowledgement moved you, please hit that like button to help others discover this powerful story. Subscribe to our channel for more narratives about unsung heroes whose contributions were deliberately hidden from history. Who else's story needs to be brought into the light? Tag someone who deserves more recognition in the comments. Thank you for bearing witness to Walter's journey. May his story remind us all that no truth remains hidden forever, and that each of us has the power to ensure that excellence is recognized regardless of who exhibits it.